Hello, glad to see you on the channel. Subscribe, give a like, and don't forget to leave a comment. Enjoy watching.
I think you've had a good run, Jack, but let's face it, this place needs fresh thinking, fresh energy. You've done great, but we're heading in a different direction. It's time for some new blood. That's what Carl Mitchell said to me. Carl, my manager, who looked like a damn walking LinkedIn ad. He leaned back in that ergonomic chair the company shelled out 2 grand for, laced his fingers behind his head like he was some kind of visionary, and smirked. And then, just for the hell of it, he chuckled. Yeah, he laughed. I mean, come on, he added with that same smug tone that could make a monk break a beer bottle over someone's head. You've been here, what, 22 years? You've seen a lot. But we're trying to stay cutting edge. We need leaders who can innovate. You understand. I didn't say a word for maybe 10 seconds, just watched him. I think that unsettled him more than if I'd started yelling. Carl always expected a reaction. He lived off of it. That phony empathy tone, the corporate buzzwords, the casual cruelty wrapped up like a performance review, it was all a game to him. One he thought he'd already won. I stood up slowly, smoothed my jacket, and said, "Thanks for the opportunity, Carl. I appreciate the clarity." Then I shook his hand and left. No drama, no grand speech, no stapler chucking tantrum, but make no mistake, I wasn't defeated. I wasn't confused. I wasn't surprised. You don't survive over 2 decades in a corporate maze without recognizing the smell of bullshit from the first whiff. Carl had been laying bricks for this little execution for months, probably longer. And while he thought he was delivering a mic drop moment, what he really did was set something in motion that was going to blow a hole through his shiny little career. I know what you're thinking. Why didn't I fight back in the room? Why didn't I call him out right there and then? Because I wasn't done. And you don't show your hand when the guy across from you is holding nothing but a bluff and a set of veneers. See, Carl had no clue what I actually did for this company. He thought I was just a dinosaur who refused to move to Agile, couldn't code in the latest language of the week, and spent half my day reminiscing about Windows NT. He never saw the late nights, never saw the strategic docs I ghost wrote for execs, never knew the fresh grads came to me, not him, when they were drowning in deadlines. Hell, he didn't even know I was the reason the client renewal numbers spiked last fall. He just assumed it was his quarterly vision deck. And that's the thing about being underestimated. People forget to watch you. But I watched him. Every phony pitch meeting, every time he nodded through tech huddles without understanding a damn word, every time he rephrased something I'd said in a meeting and made it sound like it came from his soul. I watched him play politics while I kept the lights on. So when I walked out of that room, when I took that slow, quiet walk past the open workspace where the young devs sat like caffeinated soldiers, I didn't feel bitter. I felt ready. Now, I won't pretend it didn't sting. Getting booted like that? Having your usefulness reduced to a punchline? That hurts, no matter how thick your skin is. I got in my car, sat there for a minute, and just breathed. 22 years. I'd missed birthdays, skipped vacations, ate more dinners out of vending machines than I could count. All for what? An exit meeting and a smirk. But then I started thinking, what if this wasn't the end of the road? What if it was a damn detour? What would you do if your boss stabbed you in the back like this? Would you walk away with your dignity, or would you let the fire inside start to build? Because in that moment, I realized something Carl never would. Innovation doesn't come from youth. It comes from grit, from perspective, from knowing what doesn't work because you've seen it crash and burn before. It comes from experience. And I had experience in spades. By the time I got home, I already knew what I was going to do. I poured myself a drink, one of the good ones, the kind you save for when life tells you who's boss, and I started going through my old project files. I opened up a folder called Red Sky. It was a proposal I had written 2 years ago for a new operations platform. Carl had shelved it, said it was too ambitious. He probably didn't understand half of it, but the devs, they got it. They loved it. So I sent out a message, just a quick note to a few people. Not a manifesto, not a rally cry, just, I'm moving on, starting something of my own. No promises, but if you're tired of the nonsense, Let's talk. Sent. Then I leaned back and waited. See, Carl thought he ended my story that day. He thought that laugh was the punctuation mark on my career. But what he didn't realize, what he never understood, is that I wasn't the guy in the way of innovation. I was the damn engine behind it. And engines don't die easy. 6 months before Carl Mitchell called me into that sterile, overly air-conditioned conference room and fed me the most rehearsed line of corporate garbage I had heard in 2 decades, things looked very different. Or at least, they pretended to. Back then, I was still clocking in at 7, leaving past 8, keeping a creaky, overworked department running on chewing gum and caffeine, while everyone else posted inspirational quotes on Slack and congratulated each other on disrupting paradigms. That was the season of smoke and mirrors, the time when I still believed that being the dependable guy, the one who never missed a deadline, who triple-checked every release, who taught the new hires how not to break the production server, would be enough to earn me a seat at the table. I wasn't naive, not entirely. I knew office politics. I'd seen my share of golden boys crash and burn because they confused charm with competence. But I thought Carl might be different, at least at first. He came in with all the right words, all the right smiles, and a resume full of sleek company names and even sleeker language. Agile evangelist, he called himself. Culture driver. He said we were going to rethink everything from the ground up, that we were going to build a team that didn't just work hard, but worked smart. Of course, that all sounded fine, better than fine, even. I'd spent years asking leadership to retool our workflows, upgrade the ancient systems we were duct taping together, and actually invest in people instead of chasing vendor sales pitches. If Carl was going to make some real changes, I was ready to help. I even sat down with him the second week he arrived and shared a full diagnostic on where our inefficiencies were buried. He listened, nodded, asked the right questions. At least I thought they were the right questions, but within a few weeks, things started to shift. At first, it was subtle. Weekly stand-ups got shorter and more superficial. He started skipping the tech review meetings altogether. Instead of digging into real problems, he focused on optics and presentation. Suddenly, there were more slide decks than bug fixes, more cross-functional workshops than actual shipping. The junior devs, the ones I'd spent time training, started getting reassigned to experimental initiatives, which basically meant they were spinning their wheels on ideas that sounded good in boardrooms, but collapsed the minute they touched code. Then came the first real slap in the face. I had just finished pulling an all-nighter with Ravi, one of our back-end leads, fixing a broken API deployment that was threatening to torpedo a client demo. We salvaged it, barely, and I went home that morning with a migraine and a busted tail light from backing into a dumpster in the dark. When I came in the next day, exhausted and running on fumes, Carl called an emergency team meeting to highlight recent team wins. He stood in front of the whiteboard, sleeves rolled up like he'd just come from battle, and gave a speech about how proactive leadership prevented a potential disaster, and how essential adaptability is in moments of high pressure. Then, with a straight face, he nodded at me and said, "Jack's team really pulled through, and it's great to see cross-functional accountability in action." No mention of Ravi, no mention of who actually solved the problem. Just vague applause and another shiny bullet point in his executive status report. I wish I could say that was the only time it happened, but it became a pattern. The more fires we put out, the more Carl took credit. He began to talk like he was the architect of our department's survival, as if he had somehow infused us with newfound brilliance, when in reality, he hadn't touched a single line of architecture. He knew just enough buzzwords to sound smart, and just enough management speak to convince the higher-ups that progress was being made. Worse still, I started noticing strange behaviors from HR. I'd get little pings asking about interactions I had with colleagues, questions phrased like they were doing a casual check-in, but they weren't casual at all. Just wondering how the collaboration on Project Atlas is going. We've heard there might be some communication issues. That kind of vague, insinuating language that's meant to plant seeds without outright accusing you of anything. Didn't take long to realize what was happening. Carl was slowly undermining me, not with confrontation, but with whispers. He couldn't replace me outright. Not yet. I still had too much internal knowledge, too much respect from the team. But he was setting the stage, painting me as out of touch, as someone resistant to change, difficult to work with, a legacy mindset holding back the fresh new culture he was trying to create. The irony of it all? Half the so-called innovation Carl pushed came straight from documents I'd written years ago, initiatives that had been shelved by upper management back when the budget was tighter and the risk appetite lower. Now, Carl was dusting off those same ideas, slapping new acronyms on them, and acting like he was inventing fire. But I didn't push back. Not yet. Because something else was happening. One by one, the younger devs I'd mentored had started coming to me after hours, asking questions. Not technical ones, ethical ones. They were starting to see it too. The cracks, the inflated progress reports, the focus on metrics over meaning, the way credit flowed upward while blame trickled down. They didn't say it out loud, but I could tell. They didn't trust Carl. Not really. They worked under him because they had to, but they listened to me. And that's when I understood the real difference between being a boss and being a leader. A boss talks. A leader gets followed even when they're not in the room. So I waited. I kept showing up, kept delivering, kept teaching. I documented everything. Every email, every idea Carl repackaged, every red flag HR forgot to follow up on. I smiled through meetings and took notes in silence. I let Carl believe he was winning. Let him think I was growing tired, checked out, ready to fade into retirement. But inside, I was sharpening my knife. By the time spring rolled around, Carl had built himself quite the illusion. From the outside, he looked like a rising star, someone who took a stale, slow-moving department and turned it into a lean, agile innovation center, which is what he actually called it in a company-wide town hall where he wore sneakers with his blazer and tried to act like the office version of Steve Jobs. The executives nodded, the interns clapped, and somewhere in between, the rest of us stared at the screen, wondering what the hell he was talking about. Because the truth, the hard, uncomfortable truth, was that nothing was improving. In fact, under the gloss and buzzwords, things were getting worse. Project timelines slipped behind more often. Team morale dipped in quiet, hard-to-measure ways, like the growing silence in stand-ups or the shrinking number of volunteers for stretch assignments. Bugs piled up in the backlog, and actual customer satisfaction was down, though you'd never know it from Carl's slide decks, where he'd cherry-pick a single positive user comment and blow it up on a full slide next to a photo of a mountain peak. It was surreal, watching someone spin gold from ashes, and even more surreal to see how many people bought into it. But I didn't. I kept my head down, kept smiling at the right moments, nodding when Carl made his little digs, like when he'd say things like, "We're not doing it the old school way anymore, right, Jack?" Or, "Jack, you're the historian here. Tell them how things used to be." Always with a grin, always with that tone that danced just on the edge of disrespect, but never enough to give HR something actionable. I played along, but inside I was taking notes. Not metaphorical ones, real ones. I started keeping a private log, meetings, decisions, comments, timelines, versions of proposals. I went back through emails, pulled receipts, and reconstructed who actually contributed to which ideas and how Carl manipulated them. I wasn't building a case for HR, though. I wasn't that naive. HR didn't work for employees. HR worked for the company. And right now, the company was in love with Carl. No, I was building something else. Something better. A complete, undeniable picture of how the emperor had no clothes. The tipping point came on a Thursday afternoon when I got a calendar invite from Lenny Krause, one of the senior architects, a guy who'd been around nearly as long as me and who had seen more restructurings, rebrandings, and bullshit management trends than any 5 execs combined. He didn't normally do private meetings, and certainly not on short notice, so I showed up curious. What he showed me on his screen made my pulse tick up a few notches. It was a presentation, one Carl had recently given to the executive board. Lenny had access because he'd been asked to validate a few of the technical assumptions in it, though, as he put it, validating assumptions for Carl was like proofreading graffiti. I looked at the first few slides and instantly felt my stomach twist. The framework Carl was pitching, what he called Ops Stack 2.0, was almost word for word a document I'd written the year before, one I'd sent to Carl during his onboarding under the subject line, Initial Infrastructure Thoughts. Not only had he stolen it, he hadn't even bothered to rewrite most of it. My phrasing, my formatting, even my footnotes were intact. He'd just slapped a new title on it and inserted his name on the cover slide. For a few seconds, I just stared at the screen. There was something so bald-faced about it, so brazen and lazy, that I actually felt a laugh building in my chest. Lenny didn't laugh, though. He just leaned back in his chair and said, "I figured you'd want to know. It's not the first time he's done this, but this is the first time it's this obvious." It was a strange moment. I wasn't angry, not in the way you'd expect. It was almost quiet, like the moment just before a match is struck. I thanked Lenny, copied the file, and went home early that day. Not to rest, but to plan. That weekend, I started reaching out. Nothing dramatic, no fiery speeches, just coffee chats, walk and talks, casual catch-ups with people I trusted, people I'd trained, backed, or helped over the years. I didn't pitch them anything. Not yet. I just asked how they were feeling about the direction of things, asked what they were working on, asked whether they felt like their work was being seen. The answers varied, but the tone didn't. There was a heaviness behind their words, a growing sense that they were being led in circles by a guy who didn't actually understand the map. Several of them expressed the same sentiment in different ways. "I feel like we're just spinning for show." One even said, "I don't know what Carl does all day, but it's not helping us." And still, I waited. Because setting a trap is one thing, getting someone to walk into it willingly, thinking they're in control, that's the art. I let Carl keep winning. I even complimented one of his initiatives in a meeting, called it an interesting direction, and offered to help. That seemed to boost his ego enough that he finally invited me to present something at a leadership vision sync, which I accepted without hesitation. But when the day came, I gave him exactly what he expected: a sanitized, high-level overview, non-threatening, generic, nothing that could outshine him. He relaxed, dropped his guard, assumed I was buying into his game. That night, I updated my documentation. I started building a prototype. Something small, just enough to prove that the Red Sky framework, the same one Carl had stolen, could actually be turned into a standalone product. A real product, not a slide deck. I stayed up late, coding like I hadn't in years, fueled by spite and black coffee and the quiet satisfaction of watching a plan form piece by piece. I reached out to Ravi, then 2 more devs, asked for help, no promises, no pressure. They all said yes. By the end of the month, I had 5 people quietly working with me after hours, building the bones of something Carl couldn't touch, couldn't control, and couldn't even see. It wasn't just about revenge, not anymore. It was about showing that experience isn't a liability, that knowing how to build something right still matters, even in a world obsessed with being first. Carl thought he had played me out of the game, but what he didn't know, what he couldn't know, is that I'd never been more dangerous than when I was underestimated. The morning after I was fired, Carl strolled into the office with that same smug expression plastered across his face, the one that suggested he'd already won a battle he never truly fought. He wore a bright blue button-up with the sleeves rolled just enough to make him look like he was ready to get his hands dirty, though everyone knew he hadn't touched a line of code since the Bush administration. He carried his oat milk latte, dropped a few half-hearted greetings to the younger staff, none of whom responded with much more than a nod, and walked into his glass-walled corner office like he was the crown prince of innovation itself. What Carl didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have suspected, was that the room he walked into was already a sinking ship. Because while I might have left the building the day before without fireworks or theatrics, The chain reaction I'd set off was already unfolding quietly, one hushed conversation, an unread resignation letter at a time. It had started just a few hours after I walked out. A few of the devs messaged me privately, not just to say goodbye, but to ask what was next. One of them, a quiet but brilliant front-end developer named Tara, wrote, "Please tell me you're not going to disappear. I can't keep doing this for someone like him." Another was Ravi, who I didn't even need to convince. His response was immediate. "Whatever you're building, I'm in." What surprised me wasn't that they were ready to leave. It was how fast the loyalty shifted. By that night, I had 8 people texting, calling, offering help, asking where I was headed. I never gave a full answer. Not right away. I didn't need to. All I said was, "There's something better coming. You'll know when it's time." The funny part is, Carl thought firing me would show strength. He figured cutting out old wood would make him look decisive, future-focused, sharp. But all it did was expose the rot under the surface, that the only thing holding his little empire together was the very person he kicked out the door. That morning, it began with silence. No one laughed at Carl's Monday morning pep talk. No one responded to his self-congratulatory jokes. When he asked why the sprint summary hadn't been posted yet, the new Scrum lead, Samir, replied that he was just wrapping things up, and then promptly went to HR to hand in his notice. 10 minutes later, Tara dropped hers, on paper, in person. Said nothing, just handed the envelope to Carl's assistant and walked out with her laptop already in her bag. By 11:30, 5 people had left. By 1:30, it was up to 11. All of them calm and all of them professional. No tantrums or email chains or protests. Just quiet exits, one by one, like clockwork. Some didn't even bother explaining. They didn't need to. The message was loud and clear. They weren't willing to build someone else's dreams on the bones of stolen work. And Carl? Oh, Carl was spiraling. The guy who usually strutted around the office like a motivational speaker at a tech expo was now pacing between desks, whispering questions, trying to coax people back into meetings. He even called an impromptu team sync at 3:30, but less than half the team showed up, and the ones who did mostly stared at their screens. Carl tried to smile through it, talked about realigning goals and refocusing priorities. But you could see the panic leaking through the cracks in his voice. The real beauty of it wasn't just that people left. It was how they left. I hadn't asked them to quit. I hadn't offered money, titles, or promises. What I'd offered was something Carl never could: trust. Over the years, I'd listened, I'd guided, I'd protected people from the worst parts of the machine. And when the time came, they remembered that. They remembered who had their back when the deadline was impossible and the blame was flying. Loyalty isn't bought with stock options and game room perks. It's earned day by day, the hard way. By the time the end of the day rolled around, Carl's office door was shut tight, the blinds awkwardly half closed, and his precious whiteboard had been wiped clean, probably because none of the strategic initiatives he scrawled on it in neon marker had anyone left to execute them. Somewhere around 6 p.m., I got a call from Lenny. He said, "I've never seen anything like this. It's like the damn soul of the team just packed up and walked out." I smiled and told him, "That's what happens when people realize they're not part of a team. They're just fuel for someone else's ride." Of course, not everyone left. There were a few who stayed behind, either too new, too cautious, or too entangled to make a clean break. I don't blame them. Not everyone can burn a bridge and walk away. But even among those who stayed, the mood had shifted. Carl wasn't admired. He was tolerated. And that's a kind of rot that spreads faster than any reorg memo. The next morning, a memo did go out, one from the board, not from Carl. It was carefully worded, full of concern and intent to evaluate organizational structure. I wasn't there to see it land, but someone forwarded it to me with the subject line, "Guess who's on the radar now?" I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Instead, I went back to my home office, just a desk, a whiteboard, and a project tracker with a name at the top that used to be a discarded proposal, but now felt like the future. Red sky. The team that had walked out one by one was already rebuilding, already designing something smarter, leaner, and grounded in reality instead of ego. We didn't need legacy platforms or multi-tiered approvals or a dozen meetings to brainstorm a single login screen. We needed autonomy, honesty, and the freedom to build without babysitting someone else's ambitions. Carl thought he could gut me from the company and replace my presence with a slogan. But what he never understood, and what he finally learned that day, is that when the backbone leaves, the whole body collapses. In the weeks that followed the walkout, silence fell over Carl's floor like a dense fog rolling in over a battlefield long after the fight had ended. The chatter had stopped. The endless hum of collaboration, murmured debates, fast typing, frustrated laughter had vanished. What replaced it wasn't peace or calm or even productivity, but a strange kind of sterile emptiness that no number of potted plants or motivational posters could hide. Carl sat in his office most days now, with the door cracked just enough to appear approachable, though everyone knew that he was scrambling behind that half-open barrier, sending flurries of emails, setting up last-minute meetings, and trying desperately to plug the holes in a ship he didn't even know had a hull until it started sinking. From what I heard, and there was always someone eager to tell me, he started trying to poach from other departments, pulling junior analysts and underused QA testers into his core dev team, as if building a competent product team was just a matter of shuffling bodies like chess pieces. The results, predictably, were a disaster. 2 of the largest clients had complaints within a week. The new product roadmap was delayed without a clear cause, and the last remaining senior engineer filed a transfer request by the end of the month. The board, once content to let Carl sell them digital dreams through slick presentations and buzzwords, began to ask hard questions in closed-door meetings, questions he could no longer answer with confidence. And while Carl flailed, I was already building. Red Sky, the platform I had once buried under a pile of too ambitious feedback and internal politics, was now alive in a way I had only dreamed of before. The small team that had followed me, some of the most talented, loyal, and battle-hardened people I'd ever worked with, had taken what was once a document full of ideas and turned it into something tangible, functional, and elegant. We weren't a startup in the way people imagine, with ping-pong tables and venture capital pitches delivered in hoodies. We were something leaner, quieter, and frankly more dangerous. A group of experienced professionals who had spent years inside the machine and finally had the freedom to do it right. We operated out of 2 small rented offices and a shared cloud infrastructure that cost less per month than Carl's software license budget. Our code was clean, our meetings were short, and our goals were crystal clear. No fluff, no ego, and absolutely no interest in building something just to check off boxes on a performance review. We focused on solving real problems, the kind Carl never even understood, let alone respected, and in doing so, we found clients who were desperate for that kind of clarity. One of them even came from Carl's old client list, the one I had helped on board personally years ago before he started showing up and pretending he was the rainmaker. That particular client called me out of the blue one morning, said he had heard something happened over there, and asked if I was doing anything new. I told him we were experimenting with a more modular approach to platform integration, and he said, "Whatever that means, send me a proposal." 2 weeks later, we signed our first contract. It wasn't massive, but it was real, and it proved what I had known all along. Competence, trust, and experience are still currency, even in a world obsessed with disruption for disruption's sake. But here's the part I didn't expect. I thought I would feel triumph. I thought there would be a day when I would toast with the team, look at our user metrics or our growing waitlist, and finally feel that high of revenge, that satisfying closure that so many stories promise you'll find when you finally win. But that moment never really came, at least not in the way I'd imagined. What came instead was a deeper, more complicated emotion, a blend of pride, weariness, and a strange sadness for everything that had to be broken before something better could be built. One night, well past midnight, I was sitting alone in the office going through our security architecture for a new client when I opened a spreadsheet I hadn't touched in weeks. It was simple, just a private file I'd created on the day I walked out of Carl's building. It had two tabs. The first was labeled Team, and it listed everyone who had joined me, with notes on their strengths, responsibilities, and personal goals, because I'd decided that if I ever got the chance to lead something again, I would lead it with actual humanity, not performance metrics. The second tab was labeled Blacklist Do Not Hire, and at the very top, in bold red, was one name, Carl Mitchell. I stared at it for a while, then closed the laptop. Not out of anger, not out of finality, but because I realized that Carl's name no longer needed to be there. He had already written himself out of my story. He had been a chapter, a cautionary tale, a temporary obstacle wrapped in a tailored suit. But I had moved on, and what I was building now didn't need to be defined by the wreckage I had left behind. It could stand on its own, brick by brick. Built not from spite or vengeance, but from the belief that you don't have to tear everything down to start something true. You just need to walk away from the people who don't know the value of what they're holding. I know there will be people who say I should have stayed and fought harder, or gone public, or burned him at the stake with evidence and exposure. Others might say I went too far, that orchestrating a walkout and building a rival project was a betrayal in itself. Maybe they're right. Maybe there's no clean ending to stories like these, just gray areas and long shadows. But here's what I do know. When a man laughs in your face and tells you that your best days are behind you, when he tosses your years of dedication aside like expired milk and expects you to nod and shuffle off into irrelevance, you don't owe him anything. You owe it to yourself to remember who you are, what you've built, and what still burns in your chest. And if you're lucky enough to find a few others who remember too, then maybe, just maybe, you get the chance to prove that innovation isn't about age, or energy drinks, or TED Talk jargon. Sometimes it's about knowing exactly where the cracks are, and having the guts to build somewhere else.